So, with the topic of finding your way in the world, as I was reflecting on all that we've discussed that has to do with the movement or the development from hero to artist, I was thinking a lot about how so much of my own journey of trying to find my way in this crazy world we live in and trying to make sense of how to show up, who to be, what to do, even what even I felt like I want to do or feel called to do, or what feels at many times placed in my lap to do. Because that's been a part of my journey as well. Is it's like so much of me finding my way has also been a process of taking up the things that seem to have crossed my path, whether I had wanted them or chosen them or not. And in our conversations a few years ago, a big theme that seemed to be coming forward for me was about finding my voice forward, as you had put it. And I feel like that at the core of this finding your place in the world is about finding your voice.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and that in order to find your way, you have to reclaim your voice, rediscover it, find it forward again, as you had said. And again, as I was reflecting on this, there was two big things that seem to be core or crucial in this process. And the first one is the aspect of grief and shadow. When I was starting my therapeutic journey, I read a book by Alice Miller called Drama of the Gifted Child.
yeah, me too.
And she says a lot in that book, but there was one or two lines that she said, and to paraphrase what she said in that was that the proper approach or posture towards life is to be in a constant state of mourning.
Mhm,
And when I
mhm.
read that, it just like a light switched, and it was like a flip switch, and it was like, oh,
Yeah,
to be
yeah,
in a
that's
constant state of mourning.
more. Well, that's sort of co-equivalent to Robert's grief is the doorway to mature masculinity.
Hmm.
You know, those two are, and one of the things I've said for years, if you're 40 or over, you're going to be grieving for the rest of your life
Yeah.
because you're going to experience loss after loss after loss after loss. Um, And most people, you bringing up the term the shadow, most people have their grief in their shadow. They
Hmm.
also have their anger in their shadow, but for the purposes of this discussion, we'll keep it focused on grief, sadness, sorrow. And most people really do not ever really do grief work. Uh, I divided it into sort of three categories. There's grief, grieving, and grief work. And while people might feel grief when they experience a loss, and then when there's a memorial service or something, they might start grieving, but almost no one will then do grief work. So, like, I didn't do grief work around the death of my grandfather when I was 13 until I was 33. It's just nobody told me. Now, at the funeral, I was in grief, but decades passed before I realized I have to do some grief work around that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that makes so much sense. And I think it's a helpful tool because it's like if we're going to find our way in the world, we have to find our access points back to who we really are. And
Yeah.
so much of who we are, I believe, gets lost in our experiences and in our grief, in our shadow. We can unpack that more. But, one of the things I've seen to be true about that, going back to that Alice Miller idea, is that in my role as a therapist, I've helped a ton of people through trauma, whether that be capital T trauma, little t trauma, grief, loss, bereavement, that kind of thing. And one of the things that seems to happen that just so disorients us in our lives, is the impact of these traumas and sometimes of these grief moments that leave us not knowing, not feeling like we have a reference point anymore. And especially when it comes to trauma, it seems that these overwhelming experiences, especially when they are things that are perpetrated against us, steal or rob us of certain things. And that very thing that seems to get lost for so many people in the midst of their pain is their voice, their ability to speak, their ability to cry, their ability to stand up, their ability to represent themselves in a way that has a powerful and positive effect on the world around them. And there's nothing
Well,
like loss and tragedy and trauma to make us feel like who we are um, is very insignificant.
yeah. Well, let's go back to finding a voice because one of the things, our culture is an acquisitional culture. We acquire and keep acquiring, mostly on a material level, but even somewhat on a spiritual level. And so we acquire these voices that are not ours. And those voices constitute the persona and the character that we become. And one of the things as a writer and a teacher of writing, finding one's voice is quintessential to the artistic process. But one of the things I learned a long time ago was people who are acquisitional and always trying to acquire, that sort of offsets any energy that could be devoted to finding one's voice. And most of the time, people, like you just said, don't find their voice. If they find it at all, the only time they'll find it is through crisis, catastrophe, change, transition, loss. Then the voice may be accessed. And that's the thing that I've tried to convey both to the men I've worked with, to the writers I've worked with, the women I've worked with, is access that voice. Now, part of the problem with that is there's no modeling for how to do that. And that's part of what we're going to try to present in these short talks, is not only what we have to do to secure what we long for, but how to do it. That's the biggest thing missing in pop psychology, self-help psychology, CBT, is people will say, how? I mean, people have said to me, how do you grieve? You know, I've heard that question put to me for 35 years. And there is answers.
What comes up for me when you share that is that, finding your way through this world, I think, starts with letting go of everything that you've tried to acquire in order to feel like you have some sort of understanding and wherewithal and competency to make sense of this world.
Well, one of the things that I've been working on some over the last few years is what I call unbecoming. That as I approached my 60s and 70s, I realized that I had to shed a bunch of layers of stuff that I had become, and each decade, in my opinion, requires a entire shedding of one's skin. And and in order to do that, I have to look at the things that I thought were true, felt to be right, And maybe they were in my 30s or 50s even, but in my 70s don't hold a lot of credence for now. So, like one of the things that this whole thing that we're trying to do here is to bring about more authentic behavior and being in this world that is absolutely against authenticity in every aspect of life. You go to school does not teach you how to be authentic. You go to college, it does not teach you how to, you go to writing school, it does not teach you how to be authentic. And again, I'm going to keep coming back to the fact that if somebody doesn't show you how to do something, you're not supposed to know how to do it. But there's so few people who are showing, you know, and it seems like less and less. Now there's people who are fake showing a lot, a lot, and it's leaving a lot of people disappointed.
Mhm.
So the longing to go forward has to be in part by looking backward, not in a Freudian analytical way, but in a way that works for each individual. Nobody's going to put anybody on the couch for 5 years. Woody Allen is done,
Mhm.
with that. But there has to be some recognition of where you've been in order to get where you want to go. But without guides and teachers and magicians and it's hard to get there. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
still
Yeah.
trying myself.
Oh, and the same. And I think that's in one way how you and I found our paths towards each other is we both have had to kind of figure this out in some ways on our own. And the sad reality is that leaves you with a lot of stress and strain that
Yeah.
may or may not be necessary. Um, but you and I have both fought to reclaim our voices and to find our way. And I think one of the things that I would encourage a lot of people on it who are watching this is just that within you is probably a feeling. It might be restlessness, it might be dissatisfaction, it might be frustration, who knows what it is. It might come out as anger, uh, stress, however you want to describe it. But underneath that is a voice and a message, and that can be found, I think, at the core of who you are in the space of your heart. And if you can learn to begin to honor that voice and not be reactive with it, it will lead you. The dissatisfaction will help you make better choices if you can handle it in a mature way to get yourself into different situations, pursue different things.
Mhm.
The beauty and the brutality of grief is it will upend your life and make you ask really hard questions about what really matters, what really is important, um, what really this whole thing is all about. And if you will do the intentional and again mature thing and face it and step into it and do the grief work and let the pain and the confusion manifest in an energetic way, you'll ask some hard questions and those questions will lead you. And they might, in some ways, again, the beauty and the brutality of grief is it might help you find your voice again. That means you have to find the courage and the endurance to stay with it, which is really hard. Um, and sometimes is a solitary path. Um, and I think, the guidance I would give is don't shy away from grief, embrace it as best you can, let it be something that does break things down. And as you do that, see how within you will come out a voice, and most likely it'll start with a cry, a despondency, a
A depression,
regret,
some
a
despair.
depression,
Mhm.
and maybe even a rage. Again, I think we've kind of said some of these things over and over, but like let the rage and the despondency have its words.
Yeah.
If it is grief in the very simple terms that so many people put it, like you lose someone or something happens, maybe someone dies or there's a tragedy or you go through a loss of a relationship and you're left with these overwhelming, potentially self-demeaning thoughts and feelings, but like go with them and say like, what is the question that this is asking? Because those will be the doorway to help you start to say what you've needed to say for a long time. And in that process, the more you are able to honor your heart, the more you're able to speak from that place, the more and more you'll be able to find your footing. And it's messy. It's really messy. Um, but I don't. It's the cliche thing that you hear that no one on their deathbed says, "I wish I would have worked more. I wish I would have this." But we seem to be convinced that if we work more or we do this, that that's the way. But
Well, see,
we
that's
just.
that's back to acquisition,
Mhm.
acquiring, you
Yep.
know. I was going to read a quote by Joseph Campbell to kind of close this out, but now I can't find it, of course. Um, I had it before we started. You enter the forest at the darkest point where there is no path. Where there is a way or path, it is someone else's path. You're not on your own path. If you follow someone else's way, you're not going to realize your potential. So it's very important here that you listeners do not think that Mikey or I have the way, because I don't for sure. Matter of fact, the older I get, the less, I mean, it's kind of a cliche now, but it is true. I thought I knew a lot more at 35 than I do at 72.